Alright, another response video to the conference report guy. I should put the timer on. Regarding this consciousness stuff and the hard problem. I hate the way that we end up having these discussions about stuff based on how some old philosopher framed the argument. They come up with some kind of terminology like the hard problem of consciousness, and then we're stuck, running around in a circle that maybe isn't a good circle to be running in. It's not going to answer or it's not going to reveal the truth of what consciousness is. So to me, the first obvious point to be made is that consciousness exists because it was a tool, like wings or like claws or like big teeth, or it was a tool that enabled organisms to navigate their environment better, therefore was conducive to their survival. And so genetically these were modifications that were kept in the genetic code. It worked. Consciousness works, I guess that's the point. And what's it made out of, consciousness? It's made out of these two elements, feelings and thinking. Being able to have this attractive and repulsive force that is imposed on something. So now we can feel what is the right road and what is the wrong road. And that definition can be very ambiguous. I mean, nature just cares that we get it right most of the time, not that we get it right all of the time. So it's like the plankton swimming towards the sun. Well, some days swimming towards the sun is going to be a bad idea because there's something that eats plankton that's going to be swimming around up there waiting for you, and you would have been better off, swimming for the bottom. But the probability is over time that you're going to do better if you do this simple act of being attracted to something. And so that's sort of what senses were made out of. The first senses basically just propelled organisms through the environment. Okay, they sensed what was happening by the mouth, and the anus did something to propel them. Their little tail moved, or they farted, or whatever they did, but something happened that made them reflexively respond to a stimulus that came in. And then that got converted into something that could be, that you could have this feeling, and then you had another reflex that could react to the feeling. So it wasn't just like the image was seen. It's like the image would come in, there would be a sensation created, and the brain would react to the sensation. So that's just like a second reflex. So a first reflex sees what comes in. It reflexively responded, creating a feeling, and then that feeling again is reacted to by this reflex. And so that, I think, is like the nature of our entire brain function. It's just that it is a bunch of reflexes. All language is basically just every word is a reflexive response. The brain goes through a certain pattern connected to that word, and when you put a few of these together, then obviously all the interconnections create something that might be called a concept. And that either becomes a very automatic reflex, or it's a reflex that requires thought to unwind and to find that little triggering pattern. But some of them become very automatic, like when you start talking a lot about a subject, we get it on our mind, we get really clear on how we're thinking about it, and so those thoughts keep running through our heads, and they keep, that pattern is engaged. That muscle memory, that reflex of thought, happens a lot, and so that's why we tend to like to talk about one subject at one time and then move on to something else, then move on to something else. It's because our mind gets on it and it rolls it around a lot, and the pattern's repeated, and that's very much like a reflex. So anyway, the point I wanted to get to is not exactly all this mechanics, but I mean, I think it's a simple idea. Create the desire, create the plus and minus feeling, the repulsive and attractive force that mimics what's conducive in the environment. There's good and bad things in the real world. Natural selection is just making organisms capable of choosing the good rather than the bad. What's good for it versus what's bad for it in terms of survival. And it's just labeling those things very crudely, and then having a brain decide how to best balance those things. I've used this analogy before, but I mean the basic scenario that validates the workings of our brain is, for example, some little rat back in prehistoric time with the Tyrannosauruses or something. You know, it didn't have to be a rat, but whatever. You know, it was hungry, but it was also afraid. So it was able to have two conflicting feelings. And it could balance through its own personal experience when the best time was to when the hunger was strong enough to overcome the fear, or when the fear was strong enough to suppress the hunger and keep them safe. So they were able to balance these emotions and these feelings through and intelligently moderate it and rationalize it and make it much more complicated. And there was obviously advantage to that, because now that we could pick through the little nuances of environment. And then once we gained enough intelligence, we could start really modeling the world, not just modeling our feelings, not just reacting to the emotional response to the environment, the crude, hard, sensual response. But yeah, then we were able to start modeling our existence. And then you have animals who can dream and do a lot of other things. But the point I really want to get to is that this whole story can be really quite horrific if we really start analyzing this and picking it apart. Because feelings might be the core of consciousness. Feelings, raw, harsh sensation, harsh attraction, harsh repulsion, strong forces of pain and discomfort, and strong forces of desire and addiction and attraction. And if this is what's going on in all these lower forms of life that are doing this behavior thing, and it's not just some raw reflex. I mean, they are doing a central nervous system which is functioning on this learning level. They're capable of learning, which means their brain is doing, in my opinion, the sensation thing. You know, this story of life could be really quite horrific, because that consciousness could be more substantial than ours. We could be quite fooled by our elaborate and sophisticated intellect. You know, we think intelligence is somehow consciousness, and intelligence is what reacts to consciousness. Intelligence is what's reacting to the sensations, the feelings, the emotions. And so the real substance of consciousness exists in that, and that's like I said, that makes this story a lot different. That's a context that, you know, people have to at least accept that might be the possible truth, that all these other organisms are feeling substantially harsh emotion and feelings and sensations. They're suffering hard because their nature doesn't need to regulate. It doesn't care about your welfare. It cares about your behavior. So it might be imposing tremendous pain on organisms, like a worm scurrying across the surface who starts to get too warm. Might be sensing a really horrific sensation. I mean, really harsh discomfort that's forcing him to desperately find some way to get underground, because it's such a grating and unpleasant sensation it's experiencing. And it doesn't need the context of an intelligence to be conscious, to be experiencing the sensations. And I would almost argue that being focused in that world, having your clock speed, your brain living in that world of just sensation, could theoretically be just as intense. I mean, I don't know what Helen Keller said on the subject, but I'm sure Helen Keller probably made the point that she was just as alive when she was an ignorant little monster, a little animal, as she was when she learned vocabulary. I mean, it wasn't the dawn of consciousness, it was the dawn of communication and a way to opened up a whole world for her. But she was emotionally still a very sensitive and vulnerable creature before she could step into that bigger world of other people and understanding their language and what they're saying and all the rest of this stuff. Not saying, of course, but what they're thinking, let's put it that way. So, I'm not trying to be deliberately dark. I'm just trying to throw on here that there's a context here where this isn't just some sort of academic discussion, and it's not just about being human. It's about what our conscious organisms doing. And this idea that consciousness turns on and off with human civilization is just plain bullshit. I think there's nothing to justify thinking that way. And so you've got to concede its existence in these other animals, and that it could be very harshly experienced by these other animals. And that you don't need a very complex, sophisticated context to still be incredibly sensitive and to be capable of feeling harsh discomfort. You know, very powerful force of attraction and repulsion. I mean, we'll see how it drives animals. We see it in other, even mammals that are relatively sophisticated. We can see them go bonkers insane over what they're feeling. And it's not a good story. So, anyway, enough of a video. I think